April 15th, 1818, 7:30 in the evening, and Eleanor Ashworth sat alone in the cramped attic room that had been her dwelling for the past 10 years, her needle moving with practiced precision through the emerald silk of her cousin Isabella's ball gown, mending a torn flounce with stitches so fine they would be invisible to any eye. The rain that had pounded against the small dormer window all afternoon had finally ceased, leaving the London sky washed clean and pale, the kind of evening that promised a successful ball for those fortunate enough to attend as guests rather than as unpaid servants. Eleanor was 32 years old, a fact her Aunt Beatrice mentioned with weary disappointment at least once daily, as though Eleanor's unmarried state were a personal affront, a stain upon the family's otherwise spotless reputation. The lavender gown laid across her narrow bed was 5 years out of fashion, the waist too high, the sleeves too short, but it was the best she possessed, and she would wear it tonight as she had worn it to a dozen other balls, standing in the shadows while her beautiful cousins danced. Her fingers paused in their work as her gaze drifted to the small portrait on the table beside her bed, her mother's face captured in miniature, painted in happier days when Eleanor had been a cherished daughter in a house filled with warmth. That world had vanished with her father's sudden death, followed 6 months later by her mother's, grief having accomplished what illness could not. The modest inheritance she had expected dissolved into debts no one had anticipated, and at 22, Eleanor had found herself entirely dependent upon her father's brother's widow, Aunt Beatrice, who had taken her in with the understanding that Eleanor would earn her keep. For 10 years she had served as companion, lady's maid, chaperone, and seamstress, her days filled with tasks that kept her useful enough to justify her presence, but not so valued as to warrant gratitude. From below, she heard Aunt Beatrice's sharp voice calling her name, the sound cutting through the quiet of her small sanctuary like a blade. Eleanor set aside the emerald silk with careful hands, glancing once more at her mother's portrait before rising to her feet, the worn floorboards creaking beneath her weight. Tonight would be like every other night, she told herself. Another evening of invisibility, another ball where she would stand silent and unnoticed while her cousin Lydia, married these 3 years to a wealthy baronet, preened in her finery, and Isabella, newly engaged to a viscount's son, accepted congratulations. Eleanor had long ago ceased hoping for a different fate, had schooled herself into a numb acceptance that this was her life, that she would grow old in this attic room, that she would die as she had lived for a decade, useful but unloved, necessary but unseen. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. The Pemberton Ball was at its height by 9 in the evening, the grand ballroom ablaze with the light of 3 crystal chandeliers that cast their glow upon the assembled company, upon silks and satins in every jewel tone, upon the gleaming shoulders of debutantes and the proud faces of matrons, upon the polished marble floor where dancers moved through the figures of a minuet with practiced grace. Eleanor Ashworth stood in her appointed corner near the potted palms, her outdated lavender gown marking her as clearly as a uniform might have done, her role as chaperone requiring her presence but not her participation, and she had perfected over the years the art of becoming invisible, of standing so still and silent that eyes passed over her without pause. Across the room her cousin Lydia danced with Lord Hastings, her pink silk gown shimmering as she turned, her laughter carrying above the music, and Eleanor felt nothing watching her, no envy, no bitterness, only the distant observation of one who had long ago accepted her exclusion from such pleasures. The orchestra played with skill, the music weaving through conversation and laughter, through the whisper of fans and the clink of champagne glasses, and Eleanor allowed herself to drift into the pleasant numbness that had become her refuge at these events, her mind retreating to thoughts of the book waiting in her attic room, to the quiet hours after midnight when she would finally be alone. It was then that she heard the voices, two matrons standing just beyond the palms, their words carrying with perfect clarity, though they believed themselves unobserved, and the first voice said with casual cruelty, "Why the Ashworths continue to drag that creature about is beyond my comprehension," to which the second replied, "I suppose even the useless spinster cousin must be trotted out occasionally, lest people forget she exists, though I cannot imagine why they bother when she is so thoroughly unmarriageable." And both women laughed, the sound bright and careless. Eleanor felt the words strike her chest like physical blows, felt the careful numbness crack just enough to let pain seep through, but she did not move, did not allow her expression to change. Had learned long ago that showing hurt only invited more of it, and so she stood perfectly still, her hands clasped before her, her gaze fixed on nothing, while something inside her withered a little more. She did not know that across the ballroom, Alexander Ravenscroft, Duke of Thornmere, had been watching her for the past quarter hour with growing fascination, his tall frame clad in black evening coat and breeches, an emerald pin glinting in his cravat. His dark eyes observing the woman in lavender with an attention he had granted no other person that evening. Alexander was 38 years old and weary beyond measure of the society that surrounded him, weary of ambitious mothers parading simpering daughters, weary of conversations that never moved beyond weather and gossip, weary of the constant performance that his position demanded, and he had attended tonight only because duty required it, fully expecting another tedious evening of predictable faces saying predictable things. But something in the stillness of the woman by the palms had caught his attention, some quality of quiet dignity in her bearing, and when he saw the almost imperceptible tightening of her jaw, the slight intake of breath that suggested she had heard something that wounded her, he felt an unexpected surge of curiosity about what thoughts moved behind that carefully composed expression, what strength it required to stand so alone and yet so unbowed. Eleanor stood motionless by the potted palms for several minutes after the cruel words had faded into the general hum of conversation, her body held so carefully still that she might have been carved from marble, and she told herself, as she had told herself 1,000 times before, that the opinions of shallow minds held no power over her, that she had long ago accepted her place in the world. But the lie felt thinner than usual tonight, worn threadbare by repetition. She needed air, needed the coolness of the terrace and a moment away from the glittering cruelty of the ballroom, and so she moved with quiet steps toward the French doors that stood open to the night, slipping through them with the practiced invisibility of one accustomed to moving through spaces without drawing notice. The terrace was blessedly empty, the April air cool against her heated cheeks, carrying the scent of spring flowers from the gardens below and the faint sweetness of night-blooming jasmine. And Eleanor moved to the stone balustrade, gripping its cold surface with both hands as she drew in a deep breath, willing the tightness in her chest to ease. The music from the ballroom drifted through the open doors, softer now, mingling with the distant sounds of London at night, and she closed her eyes, allowing herself this moment of weakness, this brief surrender to the pain she usually kept locked away. She did not hear the footsteps behind her, did not know she was no longer alone until a voice spoke, deep and measured and entirely unfamiliar, asking if she was unwell. Eleanor turned quickly, startled, her hand flying to her throat as she found herself facing a tall man in evening black, the emerald pin in his cravat catching the light spilling from the ballroom, and she recognized him at once, though they had never been introduced. Alexander Ravenscroft, Duke of Thornmere, the most powerful nobleman in England, standing on the terrace regarding her with an expression of what appeared to be genuine concern. She curtsied hastily, her mind racing, wondering what he could possibly want, why he would follow an insignificant woman onto a darkened terrace, and she managed to say that she was quite well, merely seeking cooler air, her voice steady despite her confusion. He moved closer, not threateningly but with a careful deliberation. Taking a position at the balustrade several feet from where she stood, his dark eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her want to retreat back into the ballroom despite her earlier need for escape. He said that he had noticed her standing alone for much of the evening, and he wondered if she would permit him the liberty of introducing himself properly. Though he suspected she already knew his name, as most people in that ballroom did, and there was something in his tone that suggested weariness with his own fame, a tiredness that Eleanor understood in her bones. She introduced herself with quiet formality, Eleanor Ashworth, and watched surprise flicker across his handsome features before he schooled them back into polite interest, saying that he had heard mention of the Ashworth family, though he confessed he had not previously had the pleasure of Miss Ashworth's acquaintance. They stood in silence for a moment, the music swelling behind them, and then he asked if she was enjoying the ball, a standard question that usually received a standard answer. But Eleanor found herself unable to summon the appropriate lie, found herself instead saying with careful honesty that she found most balls rather tedious, all the same conversations repeated endlessly, all the same performances of shallow charm, and she stopped abruptly, horrified at her own boldness, expecting censure or dismissal. Instead, Alexander Ravenscroft smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his austere features into something warmer, and he said with quiet satisfaction that he had hoped she might be different, that her face had suggested intelligence rather than vapidity, and he asked what she would prefer to discuss, if not weather and gossip. And Eleanor, surprising herself, began to speak. Eleanor woke the next morning to pale sunlight streaming through the narrow window of her attic room, the light falling across the worn counterpane and illuminating the water stains on the sloped ceiling. And for a moment she lay still, replaying the conversation on the terrace with a mixture of wonder and disbelief, examining each word as one might examine a precious stone to determine if it were genuine or merely colored glass. She told herself firmly as she rose and dressed in her simple grey morning gown that it had meant nothing, that the Duke of Thornmere had merely been kind to a woman who looked distressed, that such a man could have no real interest in the useless spinster cousin beyond a moment of charitable politeness, and yet some small, stubborn part of her heart refused to accept this reasonable conclusion, insisted on remembering the way he had looked at her as though she were worth looking at, the way he had smiled when she spoke honestly about finding balls tedious. She descended the narrow back stairs to the breakfast room at precisely 10 in the morning, her usual time, and found Aunt Beatrice already seated at the table with Lydia and Isabella, the morning light through the tall windows illuminating a scene of domestic comfort from which Eleanor felt perpetually excluded. And she took her customary seat at the far end of the table where the cold toast and weak tea were always waiting, the servants having long ago learned that Miss Eleanor required no special attention. Aunt Beatrice was reading aloud from a letter, her sharp voice filled with satisfaction as she detailed the social triumph of some distant relation, and Lydia was examining her reflection in the back of a silver spoon, turning her head this way and that to admire the smoothness of her complexion, while Isabella pushed eggs around her plate with the distracted air of one whose thoughts were entirely consumed with wedding preparations. Eleanor reached for the toast, her hand steady despite the strange fluttering in her chest, that stubborn hope that refused to be silenced. And she was spreading butter with careful attention when Lydia suddenly said without looking up from her spoon that Lord Hastings had mentioned seeing Eleanor on the terrace last night, speaking with someone, though he could not say who in the darkness. The fluttering in Eleanor's chest became a sharp, painful thing, part dread and part something she dared not name, and she said with careful indifference that she had stepped out for air and exchanged a few words with another guest, nothing of consequence, her voice betraying none of the tumult beneath. Aunt Beatrice lowered her letter and fixed Eleanor with the penetrating stare that had cowed her into submission 1,000 times before, asking sharply who this other guest had been, whether Eleanor had been introduced properly, whether she understood that any impropriety would reflect badly on the entire family, and Eleanor felt the familiar weight of disapproval settling over her shoulders like a heavy cloak. She considered lying, considered inventing some innocuous matron or elderly gentleman, but something in her rebelled against hiding the one moment of genuine connection she had experienced in years, and so she said with quiet dignity that she had spoken briefly with the Duke of Thornmere, and watched with grim satisfaction as 3 faces turned toward her in perfect synchronized shock. 3 days passed in a strange, suspended state, where Eleanor moved through the house bracing for consequences that never quite materialized, Aunt Beatrice having retreated into icy calculation rather than immediate fury. And on the afternoon of April 19th, Eleanor found herself accompanying her aunt on the weekly constitutional through Hyde Park, a duty she normally dreaded, but which today felt almost bearable given the distraction of her own tumultuous thoughts. The day was uncommonly fine, spring asserting itself with determination, daffodils blooming in brilliant clusters along the walking paths, and the trees unfurling new leaves of such tender green they seemed to glow in the afternoon sunlight. And Eleanor wore her grey walking dress, the best of her limited wardrobe, though still several years out of fashion, the fabric worn thin at the cuffs in a way she hoped was not too obvious. Aunt Beatrice walked ahead with Isabella, the two of them deep in discussion about wedding linens, their voices carrying back to where Eleanor trailed behind at the prescribed, respectful distance, and she let her mind wander to that conversation on the terrace, examining it again, as she had examined it 100 times since, trying to understand what it had meant, if anything beyond a moment of kindness from a man who could afford to be kind. They had turned onto the main path that circled the Serpentine when Eleanor heard the sound of hoofbeats, steady and purposeful, and she looked up to see a magnificent bay stallion approaching with a rider whose dark evening coat and commanding posture she recognized even at a distance, her heart performing an uncomfortable acrobatic feat in her chest. Alexander Ravenscroft reined in his horse several yards ahead of where Aunt Beatrice and Isabella walked, and Eleanor watched her aunt's back stiffen with surprise as the Duke dismounted with fluid grace and bowed, his greeting carrying clearly in the spring air, and then he was speaking to her aunt with perfect propriety, asking after her health and making some pleasant observation about the weather while his dark eyes moved past Beatrice to find Eleanor standing frozen on the path behind. Aunt Beatrice recovered from her shock with admirable speed, her voice taking on the honeyed tone she reserved for social superiors, as she introduced Isabella with elaborate praise of her accomplishments and her impending marriage to the son of a viscount, and Eleanor felt the familiar weight of invisibility settling over her shoulders, the expectation that she would remain in the background unacknowledged. But then Alexander was asking with pointed courtesy whether there was not another Miss Ashworth in their party. Eleanor moved forward because she had no choice, her feet carrying her to where the others stood, even as her mind raced with confusion and cautious hope, and she curtsied as Alexander bowed, his eyes holding hers for a moment longer than propriety strictly allowed, something warm and deliberate in his gaze that made her breath catch. He said that he had hoped he might encounter them on their walk, that he took this path regularly when exercising his horse Tempest, and the name hung in the air between them with weight Eleanor could not quite interpret. And then he was asking if they might walk together for a portion of the circuit, offering his arm to Aunt Beatrice with impeccable manners while falling into step beside Eleanor in a configuration that seemed both accidental and entirely intentional. They walked in a strange processional, Aunt Beatrice on the Duke's right arm holding forth about some society matter, while Eleanor walked on his left, close enough that she could hear him murmur sotto voce that he was very glad indeed to see her again, Miss Ashworth, and had she had opportunity to finish the book they had discussed, and Eleanor found herself responding in the same quiet tone that yes, she had, that she had found the author's treatment of moral philosophy unexpectedly nuanced, and just like that, they were conversing as though the intervening days had not happened, as though it were the most natural thing in the world for a duke to seek out the company of an impoverished spinster on a public path in Hyde Park where anyone might see. A week passed in a fever of confusion, and Eleanor found herself on the evening of April the 26th standing in the entrance hall of Ashworth House, staring at 3 cream-coloured envelopes that rested on the silver salver, each one addressed in elegant script to Miss Eleanor Ashworth, invitations that had arrived over the course of the past days from hostesses who had never before acknowledged her existence, and her hands trembled slightly as she reached for them before Lydia's sharp voice stopped her with a command to leave them where they were until Aunt Beatrice could review them. Eleanor withdrew her hand and stepped back, that familiar posture of submission, but something inside her had shifted in these strange days of repeated encounters with the Duke of Thornmere, 3 meetings now that could not all be coincidence, no matter how much she told herself they must be, and she felt simultaneously terrified and desperately hopeful, a combination that left her feeling constantly on the verge of some catastrophe she could not name. The family gathered in the drawing-room at 6 in the evening, as was their custom before dinner, and Aunt Beatrice swept in with the invitations in hand, her face arranged in an expression Eleanor knew well, that particular combination of calculation and displeasure that meant she was working through some social equation whose variables Eleanor could not see. Lydia lounged on the settee in a gown of emerald silk that set off her fair colouring to perfection, her beauty undimmed by the petulant expression she wore as she examined her nails, while Isabella stood by the window in pale pink muslin, her pretty face thoughtful in a way that made Eleanor more nervous than Lydia's obvious irritation. Aunt Beatrice began without preamble, saying that it seemed Eleanor had somehow attracted the notice of the Duke of Thornmere, a circumstance so improbable that one could only assume some mistake or misunderstanding. And yet the invitations had arrived, and society was beginning to talk, whispers that had reached Beatrice through her network of correspondence, speculation about the Duke's strange interest in the plain, poor relation of the Ashworth family. Eleanor stood near the door, her usual position, neither fully in the room nor fully out of it, and she felt the weight of 3 pairs of eyes assessing her as though she were a puzzle that had suddenly become relevant. And Lydia said with a laugh that carried no humour that perhaps the Duke was one of those peculiar men who enjoyed charity cases, that he was known for his reforming tendencies, and perhaps he had decided to rescue a pitiable spinster the way some gentlemen rescued stray dogs. The words struck like physical blows, but Eleanor kept her face composed, that mask she had perfected over years of similar cruelties. And she said nothing, because there was nothing to say. No defense she could offer against the fundamental truth that she was indeed pitiable, that Alexander's attention made no logical sense, that there must be some explanation beyond the impossible notion that he simply enjoyed her company. Isabella spoke then, her voice thoughtful rather than cruel, suggesting that whatever the Duke's motivations, they should not waste the opportunity, that Eleanor could be useful in securing invitations and introductions for the family, that they should encourage the connection while it lasted. And Eleanor felt something cold settle in her stomach at the calculating tone, at the casual assumption that she existed only as a tool for others' advancement. Aunt Beatrice nodded slowly, saying that Isabella was quite right, that Eleanor would of course make herself available to the Duke should he continue his attentions, that she would be gracious and accommodating, and here her voice took on a warning edge, that she would do nothing to embarrass the family, or presume anything beyond her station, that she would remember she was accepting charity from relatives who could just as easily withdraw their support if she became difficult or developed inappropriate expectations. Eleanor's hands were trembling now in the folds of her worn evening dress, and she clasped them together tightly, and she heard herself say in a voice that sounded distant to her own ears that she understood perfectly, that she would not forget her place. But even as she spoke the words, some part of her was remembering the way Alexander had looked at her in Hyde Park, the warmth in his dark eyes, the way he had sought her conversation not for duty, but for what seemed like genuine pleasure, and she could not reconcile that memory with her family's cruel theories about charity and peculiarity and useful tools. 2 days later, on the afternoon of April the 28th, Eleanor found herself standing in Lady Pemberton's celebrated rose garden, the air heavy with the scent of blooming flowers and her own anxiety, wearing her best dress of blue muslin that was still painfully modest compared to the elaborate confections worn by the other ladies present, and she had come to this garden party with her family under strict instructions from Aunt Beatrice to be gracious and useful, and above all, to secure additional invitations through whatever continued, inexplicable favor she held with the Duke. The garden was magnificent, white and pink roses climbing trellises and spilling over stone walls, and Eleanor had separated from her family at the first opportunity, seeking refuge among the blooms where she might compose herself before the inevitable moment when Alexander either appeared or did not, and she was trying very hard not to hope for the former, while bracing for the disappointment of the latter when his voice came from behind her, that distinctive, deep, measured tone, saying her name like a question and a greeting combined. She turned to find him approaching along the gravel path, immaculately dressed as always, something purposeful in his stride that made her heart perform its now familiar acrobatics, and when he reached her he bowed and asked if she might spare him a few moments of conversation, gesturing to a stone bench partially hidden by an arbor heavy with climbing roses. They sat, and Eleanor was acutely conscious of how close he was, closer than propriety strictly demanded, close enough that she could see the fine weave of his coat and catch the subtle scent of sandalwood. And for a long moment neither spoke, the silence filled with distant conversation from other guests, and the drowsy hum of bees among the roses. Alexander said at last that he hoped she would forgive his presumption, but he had noticed a sadness in her eyes at their last meeting, a weight that seemed to press upon her spirits, and he wanted her to know that if there was anything troubling her, anything at all, she could speak freely with him, that he hoped they had progressed beyond mere formality to something approaching friendship. Eleanor felt tears prick unexpectedly at her eyes, because kindness was always harder to bear than cruelty, and she said carefully that he was very good, that she was quite well. But her voice wavered on the words betraying their falseness, and Alexander leaned forward slightly, his dark eyes searching her face with an intensity that made it impossible to look away. He said quietly that he would not press her to confide what she did not wish to share. But he wanted to tell her something, a story perhaps, about his own mother who had died when he was 15, a woman of great intelligence and warmth who had been dismissed by society as unsuitable because she came from a family of modest means, and his father had married her anyway over the violent objections of his entire family, and Alexander had grown up watching his parents share a partnership of genuine affection and respect that was rare in their world. His voice was low and intent as he continued, saying that his mother had taught him that true worth had nothing to do with fortune or fashion, that the qualities that mattered were intelligence and kindness and strength of character, and he had spent his adult life watching society elevate emptiness and ignore substance, watching beautiful shallow women be celebrated while women of real depth were dismissed as unmarriageable, and he had begun to think he would never find someone whose conversation did not bore him within 5 minutes, whose mind did not glide across the surface of things, but actually engaged with ideas. Eleanor sat frozen, barely breathing, and Alexander turned to face her more fully and said with quiet certainty that from the moment he had first spoken with her on that terrace, she had been a revelation. That talking with her was like finally finding water after years of thirst, and he wanted her to understand that his attention was not charity or peculiarity or any of the cruel theories society might invent, but simple recognition of exceptional worth. That evening, Eleanor climbed the narrow stairs to her attic room at 10 in the evening, her legs trembling with exhaustion that had nothing to do with physical exertion and everything to do with the emotional tempest that had been raging inside her since Alexander had spoken those impossible words in the rose garden. And she closed the door behind her and leaned against it for a long moment in the darkness, before lighting the single candle that was her nightly allowance, its small flame casting shadows across the sloped ceiling and worn floorboards of the cramped space that had been her sanctuary for 10 years. The room was barely large enough for the narrow bed and small chest that held all her worldly possessions, so different from the spacious chambers her cousins occupied below. But Eleanor had long ago made peace with the physical manifestation of her place in the household, had told herself that at least she had a roof and food, and was not entirely destitute like so many women in her position. But tonight, the smallness of the space felt suffocating in a way it never had before, because Alexander's words had opened something inside her that she had kept locked away for so long she had forgotten it existed. She sat on the edge of the bed and reached for the locket she wore always beneath her dress. The one piece of jewelry she owned, a simple gold oval that had belonged to her mother and contained a miniature portrait of both her parents painted in happier times when they had been young and in love and alive, and she opened it with trembling fingers and looked at their faces in the candlelight, those beloved features she could barely remember except through this small painting and a handful of fragmented memories. Her mother had been 35 when she died of a fever, her father following 6 months later of what the doctors called pneumonia. But what Eleanor had known, even at 22, was a broken heart, and she had been left with nothing but this locket and a few books and the dubious charity of relatives who had never approved of her father's choice to marry for love rather than fortune, who saw her as a living reminder of foolish romanticism and its inevitable consequences. She had believed them for so long, had internalized the lesson that love was a luxury she could not afford, that her only hope for survival was quiet acceptance of whatever scraps of security her family chose to provide. And she had watched year after year as other women married, and she remained frozen in this attic room, growing older and more invisible, until she had become that pitiable creature her cousins mocked, the useless spinster cousin whose best years were behind her and whose future held nothing but slow decline into complete dependence. But Alexander had looked at her today with those dark, intense eyes and told her she was exceptional, that talking with her was like water after years of thirst, and the words had struck something deep inside her that was now cracking open like earth after drought, painful and terrifying and desperately hopeful all at once. And she clutched her mother's locket and felt tears sliding down her cheeks as she admitted to herself what she had been trying to deny, that she was falling in love with him, that somewhere between that first conversation on the terrace and this afternoon in the rose garden, she had begun to hope for something she had no right to hope for, and the realization filled her with a fear so profound she could hardly breathe, because hope was the most dangerous thing in the world. Hope could destroy her more completely than 10 years of casual cruelty ever had, and she knew with terrible certainty that when this ended, when Alexander inevitably realized his mistake, or society's pressure became too great, or he simply grew bored with his peculiar charity case, the pain would be unendurable. But even knowing that, even understanding the inevitable destruction that awaited her, she could not seem to stop the hope from blooming wild and reckless in her chest, and she sat alone in her attic room, listening to rain begin to fall outside, and the distant clock strike 10, and admitted to the darkness and her mother's painted face that it was already too late to protect herself, that she loved him, and the loving would break her, but she could not seem to stop. 5 days later, on the morning of May 3rd, Eleanor found herself standing in the entrance hall of Ravenscroft House at 11 in the morning, her heart beating so hard she was certain everyone could hear it. And she clutched her worn reticule with trembling fingers as a footman in immaculate livery took her modest shawl, and she tried not to stare at the marble floors and soaring ceiling and massive chandelier that spoke of wealth so far beyond her experience, it felt like entering a palace, and she was acutely aware of Lady Margaret Sinclair standing beside her, that kind older woman who had been her mother's dear friend and who had agreed to serve as chaperone for this visit with a knowing smile that made Eleanor both grateful and terrified, because it suggested possibilities she did not dare consider. Alexander appeared at the top of the grand staircase and descended with that unconscious grace he possessed, dressed more casually than she had ever seen him in dark trousers and a burgundy waistcoat. And he greeted them both with genuine warmth before offering Eleanor his arm and saying he hoped she would not mind. But he had taken the liberty of assuming she shared his love of books, and he thought she might enjoy seeing his library. And Eleanor managed to murmur something appropriately grateful, while thinking that enjoy was a pale word for the desperate hunger she felt at the prospect, because books had been her refuge and escape for so many years, and the Ashworth household maintained only a small collection of insipid novels that she had read a dozen times each. He led them down a corridor lined with portraits of stern-looking ancestors, and through a set of double doors that opened onto a room so magnificent Eleanor actually gasped, unable to contain her reaction, because the library stretched 2 full stories high with floor-to-ceiling shelves on every wall, thousands upon thousands of leather-bound volumes in every color, and tall windows flooded the space with morning sunlight that caught the dust motes floating in the air and made them look like gold, and the smell of leather and paper and old ink was so intoxicating she felt almost dizzy with it. Lady Margaret settled herself tactfully in a chair near the windows with her embroidery, providing proper supervision while remaining distant enough to allow private conversation, and Alexander guided Eleanor deeper into the room, watching her face with an expression of such pleasure that she realized he had wanted to share this specifically with her, had wanted to see her reaction. And the intimacy of that gesture made her chest tight with emotion she could not name. He showed her section after section, pulling down volumes to show her, his long fingers gentle on the aged spines, pointing out first editions and rare translations, and his own particular favorites, with a boyish enthusiasm that was utterly different from his usual controlled demeanor, and Eleanor found herself responding with equal animation, forgetting to be shy or careful as they discussed poetry and philosophy and history, their conversation flowing with an ease that felt like coming home. And she realized with a kind of wonder that here in this beautiful room surrounded by books, they were simply 2 people who loved the same things, and for these moments the gap between Duke and penniless spinster seemed to disappear entirely. He pulled down a slim volume bound in green Morocco leather and said this was a collection of poetry by a relatively unknown poet that he had discovered years ago and returned to again and again, and he opened it to a marked page and read aloud a verse about finding unexpected beauty in overlooked places, his deep voice soft and intent. And when he finished, he closed the book carefully and held it out to her and said he would be honored if she would accept it as a gift, that he could think of no one who would appreciate it more. And Eleanor took it with shaking hands, knowing this was more than a book, that it was a message and a promise and a declaration of something neither of them had spoken aloud yet, but that hung in the air between them as tangible as the morning sunlight streaming through those tall windows. That evening, Eleanor returned to Ashworth House at 8 in the evening with the green Morocco leather poetry book hidden beneath her shawl, pressed against her ribs like a secret, and she slipped through the front door hoping to reach her attic room unnoticed because she desperately needed time alone to process the overwhelming emotions swirling through her after those hours in Alexander's magnificent library. But before she could reach the stairs, Lydia's sharp voice called out from the drawing room, demanding she come in immediately, and Eleanor's stomach dropped with the familiar dread that accompanied any summons from her cousins, because she knew that tone, knew it meant trouble. She entered the drawing room to find all three of them waiting like a tribunal, Aunt Beatrice in her usual chair by the fire. Lydia draped dramatically across the settee in a gown of emerald silk that had probably cost more than Eleanor's entire wardrobe accumulated over 10 years, and Isabella perched on the window seat with that calculating expression she wore when scheming, and the air felt thick with hostility as Eleanor stood just inside the doorway, clutching her reticule and trying to keep the book concealed in the folds of her skirt. Lydia spoke first, her beautiful face twisted with an ugly emotion Eleanor recognized as jealousy, saying they had heard the most extraordinary rumors that Eleanor had spent the morning at Ravenscroft House, that the Duke himself had shown her his private library. And was it true, or had society's gossips finally descended into complete fiction? And there was such venom in her voice that Eleanor felt her spine straighten instinctively with that quiet dignity that had sustained her through years of similar attacks. She confirmed calmly that, yes, she had been invited to view the Duke's library with Lady Margaret Sinclair as chaperone, and she watched Lydia's face flush with rage, while Isabella exchanged a significant look with their mother, and Aunt Beatrice leaned forward in her chair with those cold eyes that had never held anything but calculation, and said they needed to discuss Eleanor's situation frankly, because this had gone quite far enough. The words that followed were delivered with surgical precision, designed to wound. Aunt Beatrice saying that everyone knew the Duke was merely amusing himself with Eleanor as a peculiar charity case, that men of his station did not seriously court penniless spinsters of 32 with no beauty or connections, and if Eleanor had any sense, she would realize she was being used as some sort of social experiment, or perhaps he had made a wager with his friends about befriending the most unlikely woman in London, and the casual cruelty of it stole Eleanor's breath, even though she had heard similar sentiments whispered behind fans at a dozen social events. Isabella added her voice with false sweetness, saying that of course they only wanted to protect dear Eleanor from inevitable humiliation, that when the Duke tired of his game and moved on, the scandal would be enormous, and Eleanor's position in their household might become quite untenable, and the threat beneath the concern was unmistakable. And Lydia laughed that harsh, brittle sound and said surely Eleanor was not stupid enough to believe a Duke actually cared about her opinions on poetry and philosophy, that he was clearly laughing at her behind her back, just as everyone else did. Eleanor stood alone facing the three of them, and felt the book pressed against her ribs, and remembered Alexander's face as he had read that verse about unexpected beauty in overlooked places, remembered the genuine warmth in his eyes, and the careful way he had handled the volumes and the enthusiasm in his voice when they discussed ideas, and she realized with sudden crystalline clarity that her family was terrified, that they had kept her small and doubtful and grateful for scraps for so long that her emerging happiness threatened the entire structure of their superiority. And something shifted inside her that felt like bedrock underneath shifting sand. She met her aunt's cold gaze and said quietly but clearly that she appreciated their concern, but she would make her own judgments about the Duke's character and intentions, and her voice did not shake, even though her hands were trembling, and she turned and walked from the room with her head high, while behind her Aunt Beatrice's voice rose in outrage, promising there would be consequences for such ingratitude. But Eleanor just kept walking, climbing the stairs to her attic room, where she finally closed the door and leaned against it, breathing hard. And she pulled out the green leather book and opened it to the marked page, and read Alexander's words again, and chose deliberately consciously to believe in the gift and the giver rather than the poison her family had tried to plant in her heart. 3 days later, on the afternoon of May the 6th at 4 in the afternoon, Eleanor found herself walking through Hyde Park beside Alexander, with Lady Margaret trailing at a discreet distance as chaperone, and the spring air was warm with that peculiar heaviness that precedes a storm, clouds gathering dark and ominous on the horizon. And Eleanor felt those clouds inside her chest as well, because the past 3 days since the confrontation with her family had been agony, as their words circled endlessly through her mind, poisoning every memory of Alexander's kindness, and making her question everything she thought she understood about his intentions. She had debated cancelling this meeting, had actually written a note pleading headache before tearing it up because she could not bear to lie to him even through correspondence. But now that she walked beside him, she found herself maintaining careful physical distance, a full 2 feet between them, where before she had allowed their arms to nearly brush, and she kept her responses brief and polite when he commented on the weather and the flowering trees, her voice colourless in a way she knew he must notice because she saw confusion flicker across his face, followed by something that looked almost like hurt. Alexander's bay stallion. Tempest walked behind them, held by a groom, and the horse seemed to sense his master's mood, tossing his head restlessly and pulling at the lead. And Eleanor thought wildly that even the animal understood something was wrong between them, that the easy connection they had built over weeks of careful conversation was fracturing under the weight of her family's threats, and her own terrible certainty that she must protect him from the scandal of associating with someone so far beneath him. He asked if she had enjoyed the poetry collection he had given her, and she said yes, it was lovely. Just those bland, insufficient words, when in truth she had read it cover to cover 3 times in her attic room by candlelight, memorizing verses that seemed to speak directly to her heart. But she could not tell him that now, because telling him would make this harder, and she needed to find the strength to end this before his reputation suffered further damage from his inexplicable interest in the useless spinster cousin. They reached a more secluded path lined with oak trees, and Alexander stopped walking abruptly and turned to face her, with an expression of such direct concern that Eleanor had to look away, focusing on a point past his shoulder where storm clouds roiled darker, and his voice when he spoke was careful, but edged with frustration, asking what had changed. Telling her he could sense her withdrawal, and he needed to understand what he had done wrong, whether his gift had been inappropriate or his invitation to his home had caused her discomfort, and the assumption that he was at fault made her chest ache, because of course he would blame himself. Of course his natural generosity would interpret her distance as response to some failing on his part, rather than what it truly was, which was her desperate attempt to spare him from her family's machinations and society's judgment. Eleanor forced herself to meet his gaze, and said with a steadiness that cost her everything, that perhaps they had been seen together too frequently, that people were talking, and she did not wish to damage his standing, and she watched his eyes darken not with agreement, but with something that looked like anger, though not directed at her, and he took a step closer, closing some of that careful distance she had maintained, and said in a low, intense voice that he did not give a damn what people said, and he needed her to tell him the truth about what was frightening her away. The thunder rumbled overhead, matching the storm building between them, and Eleanor felt her careful control beginning to crack, because his persistence was both wonderful and terrible. because every moment in his presence made it harder to do what she knew she must do, which was let him go before her poisonous family could sink their claws any deeper into this fragile, beautiful thing that had grown between them. And she opened her mouth, not knowing what words would emerge, protection or truth, ending or beginning. 2 days later, on the evening of May the 8th, at 7 in the evening, Eleanor sat in Alexander's private opera box at Covent Garden, feeling as though she existed in some impossible dream that would shatter at any moment. And the box was positioned prominently where all of society could observe who occupied it. Crimson velvet seats and gilt railings that caught the light from hundreds of candles illuminating the grand theatre. And she was painfully aware of every eye that turned their direction, every fan that rose to conceal whispered speculation, every knowing look exchanged between matrons who were clearly wondering what on earth the Duke of Thornmere was doing with that Ashworth spinster in the most public possible venue. She wore a gown of pale blue silk that Isabella had grudgingly lent her only after Alexander's invitation had arrived with such formal correctness that even Aunt Beatrice could not refuse it. But Eleanor had discovered while dressing that the gown had been altered, taken in at strategic points so it fit poorly and hung strangely, making her appear even more awkward and ill-suited to these surroundings. And the deliberate cruelty of it had stolen her breath because her family would sabotage even this, would ensure she looked ridiculous beside Alexander's polished elegance. She had come tonight with the resolution that this must be farewell, that she would find some way during the evening to make him understand that his continued attention was damaging to them both, that she could not bear to watch society tear him down for his inexplicable interest in someone so far beneath him, and her heart felt leaden with the grief of what she was about to lose, even as the orchestra began tuning their instruments for Mozart's Don Giovanni. Alexander sat beside her closer than strict propriety allowed, close enough that she could smell the subtle scent of sandalwood, and something uniquely him, and he looked magnificent in black evening clothes that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders and the silver threading through his dark hair at his temples. And when he turned to look at her, his expression held such focused intensity that she had to look away toward the stage. He had been quiet during the carriage ride to the theatre, watching her with that same penetrating gaze, and she knew he sensed her intention to end whatever this was between them, knew he understood this felt like goodbye, and instead of accepting her withdrawal with relief as any sensible man would, he seemed coiled with determination like tempest before a jump, gathered and purposeful. The opera began, and Eleanor tried to focus on the music, on the elaborate costumes and the soaring voices, but she was overwhelmingly conscious of Alexander beside her, of his arm resting on the shared armrest so his sleeve brushed hers, of the way he leaned slightly toward her when the tenor began the famous catalogue aria, and she felt tears prickling behind her eyes, because this beauty, this moment, this impossible situation would soon be only memory. At the intermission, when the curtain fell and the house lights rose, Alexander stood and offered his hand with courtly grace, and his voice was quiet but absolutely firm when he said they needed to talk privately, and Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs as she placed her gloved hand in his and allowed him to guide her from the box into the corridor beyond where the crowd parted before the Duke's presence, and she saw the stares and the whispers, but Alexander seemed utterly indifferent, leading her to a small private alcove off the main corridor where the noise of intermission conversations faded to a distant hum. The alcove was dimly lit with only a single wall sconce, casting flickering shadows across Alexander's face, and the sounds of intermission conversation created a distant hum that made their privacy feel both intimate and precarious. And Eleanor pressed her back against the damask wallpaper, feeling her carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble under the weight of everything she had tried to hold inside. And Alexander stood close enough that she could see the concern etched in the lines around his eyes, the determination in the set of his jaw, and his voice was low and urgent when he said he needed to understand what had happened, what had changed between the warmth of their conversation in his library and this terrible distance she kept trying to impose. Eleanor felt the first tear escape before she could stop it, sliding hot down her cheek. And she said in a voice that trembled despite her best efforts that he did not understand what associating with her cost him, that society was vicious and her family was worse, and the words began spilling out faster as the dam broke, telling him about the confrontation in the drawing-room, about Aunt Beatrice's threats to spread rumors that Eleanor was manipulating him for his fortune, about Lydia's poison suggestions that he was only interested because Eleanor would be grateful and biddable, unlike women of his own standing, about Isabella's calculating schemes to use Eleanor's connection to secure better matches, and she told him about the altered dress she wore tonight, about the deliberate sabotage designed to make her look ridiculous beside him. And her voice broke completely when she said she could not bear to be the reason society turned against him, could not endure watching his reputation suffer because he had shown kindness to someone so far beneath him. Alexander's expression transformed as she spoke, anger darkening his features, but not directed at her, never at her, and when she finished he reached out slowly, giving her time to refuse, and took both her hands in his, the first time he had truly touched her skin to skin because her gloves lay discarded in the opera box, and his hands were warm and strong and steady, and he said in a voice that shook with controlled fury that her family's treatment was unconscionable, that their cruelty revealed everything about their character and nothing about her worth, and he told her he did not give a single damn what society thought, that his position was unassailable enough that he could weather any gossip, but more than that he would not allow fear of small-minded judgment to rob him of the most genuine connection he had ever known. Eleanor stared at him through tears, barely breathing, and he continued speaking with increasing intensity, saying he had spent 38 years surrounded by people who wanted his title, his wealth, his influence, who performed and postured and schemed, and then he had found her, standing with quiet dignity amid cruelty, speaking with intelligence and wit and depth, seeing him as a man rather than a title. And did she truly believe he would walk away from that because some gossips whispered or her poisonous family made threats? His hands tightened on hers, and he said with absolute certainty that he intended to court her properly and publicly, that he would stand between her and anyone who tried to hurt her, and nothing her family threatened or society whispered would change his resolve, because she had become infinitely precious to him. And Eleanor felt hope blaze through her chest like fire, terrifying and glorious and utterly transformative. And she whispered that she was falling in love with him, the truth emerging raw and unguarded. And Alexander's expression softened into something so tender it made her breath catch, and he said quietly that he had already fallen, completely and irrevocably. And the opera music swelled in the theatre beyond as he raised her hands to his lips and kissed her knuckles with a reverence that felt like benediction, like promise, like the beginning of everything. The morning of May 9th arrived with crystalline clarity, spring sunlight pouring through the tall windows of Alexander's private study at Ravenscroft House, and he sat at the mahogany desk that had belonged to his grandfather and his father before him, the weight of lineage and decision pressing pleasantly against his chest as he turned the small velvet box over in his hands, the ring inside catching the light in flashes of deep blue fire. Thomas Pembroke sat across from him in one of the leather chairs, his expression caught between amusement and genuine concern, and Alexander knew his friend had arrived this morning, expecting to talk him out of what society would certainly consider madness. But Thomas did not yet understand that Alexander had never been more certain of anything in his entire life. The ring was his mother's sapphire, a stone the color of midnight surrounded by small diamonds, and he remembered how it had looked on her hand when she had tucked him into bed as a child, how she had told him that someday he would give it to someone who made his heart feel both peaceful and wild at once, someone who saw him clearly and loved him anyway. And his mother had been gone for 20 years, but he thought she would have uttered Eleanor, would have recognized immediately the quiet strength and gentle wisdom that reminded him so much of his mother's own grace. Thomas cleared his throat and said with careful diplomacy that he understood Alexander had formed an attachment to Miss Ashworth, and no one could question her character or intelligence. But had Alexander truly considered what this match would mean for his position, the gossip it would generate, the way certain doors might close to a duchess who came without fortune or family connections, or the kind of beauty that silenced criticism? Alexander set the ring box down on the desk between them and met his friend's eyes steadily, and his voice was calm but absolutely firm when he said that he had considered everything, had spent weeks observing how Eleanor moved through a world that diminished her, had watched her maintain dignity when others would have broken or grown bitter, had discovered in their conversations a mind that challenged and delighted him, a perspective that made him see familiar things newly. And more than that, he had felt peace in her presence, had found himself thinking not of duty or obligation, but of how she looked when she smiled, how her voice softened when she spoke of books she loved, how brave she was in ways society would never recognize or value. He told Thomas that he was 38 years old and had spent 2 decades being pursued by women who wanted his title, who performed whatever character they thought would snare a duke, who looked at him and saw power and wealth and prestige. And in all those years he had never once felt what he felt when Eleanor looked at him and saw simply Alexander, a man who could be lonely, who valued ideas over appearances, who wanted to be known rather than merely admired. Thomas leaned back in his chair and studied Alexander with the frankness of old friendship, and then his expression softened into something almost tender, and he said quietly that he had never seen Alexander like this. That if Miss Ashworth had captured his heart so thoroughly, then Thomas would stand beside him regardless of what society whispered, and Alexander felt gratitude wash through him because he knew the proposal itself would be easy, but the aftermath would require allies, would demand he protect Eleanor from the very world he was asking her to enter as his duchess. They discussed timing and practicalities, the formal call he would make to the Ashworth house that afternoon, the announcement that would need to be carefully worded for the papers, the wedding that Alexander wanted sooner rather than later because he had waited long enough and saw no purpose in lengthy engagements, and through it all he kept touching the ring box, anchoring himself to the certainty that by tonight Eleanor would wear his mother's sapphire, and the entire world would know she belonged to him as completely as he belonged to her. The afternoon of May the 9th arrived with Eleanor trapped in a state of anxious uncertainty in her small attic room, her hands trembling as she tried to focus on mending a torn hem, but kept stabbing her finger with the needle because her mind could not settle after the revelations at the Opera House 2 nights before, and she had replayed Alexander's words 1,000 times, his declaration that he had fallen completely and irrevocably, the way his lips had felt against her knuckles like a promise. But in the harsh light of subsequent days, doubt crept back in, because surely no duke actually married penniless spinsters, regardless of what emotions might pass between them in the shadows of opera houses. She heard the commotion downstairs at precisely 3 o'clock, the sudden flurry of servants moving quickly, Aunt Beatrice's voice rising in a tone Eleanor recognized as panic mixed with calculation. And then the youngest housemaid appeared breathless at her attic door, saying Miss Eleanor was to come down immediately because the Duke of Thornmere himself had arrived and was asking to speak with Mrs. Ashworth in the formal drawing-room, and Eleanor's heart began hammering so hard she thought she might faint as she smoothed her plain grey dress and descended the narrow servants' stairs with legs that felt like water. The formal drawing room was a space usually reserved for only the most important callers, decorated in blue silk wallpaper that had cost more than Eleanor's entire wardrobe, and when she reached the ground floor, she could see through the partially open door that Alexander stood near the fireplace in impeccable formal day dress, dark coat, and perfectly tied cravat, his posture radiating controlled power and absolute purpose. And Aunt Beatrice sat on the settee looking as though she could not decide whether to be outraged or obsequiously delighted, her face shifting between expressions as she clearly tried to calculate what this unprecedented visit might mean. Eleanor hovered in the hallway just out of sight, her hand pressed against the wallpaper to steady herself. And she could hear Alexander's deep, measured voice saying that he had come to formally request permission to pay his addresses to Miss Eleanor Ashworth, that his intentions were entirely honourable and his suit serious, and he wished to make clear that he intended to court Eleanor with the aim of marriage if she would accept him. And the words were so proper and formal, yet underneath Eleanor could hear the steel that meant he would not be denied or dismissed. Aunt Beatrice's voice when she responded was strangled with shock, barely concealed beneath forced politeness, saying that she was, of course, honoured by his interest, but perhaps the Duke did not fully understand Eleanor's circumstances, her lack of dowry or connections, her unfortunate plainness and advanced age, all spoken with a false concern that barely masked the cruelty. And Eleanor felt shame burn through her chest at hearing her inadequacies catalogued before the man she loved. Alexander's response cut through the room like a blade, his voice hardening as he said he understood Miss Ashworth's circumstances perfectly and found nothing unfortunate about her except the family that had failed to value her, and his interest was not in dowries or connections, but in Eleanor herself, and he would appreciate if Mrs. Ashworth would grant permission and summon Eleanor to the drawing-room, as he wished to speak with her privately, though of course with proper chaperoning. There was a long, terrible silence, and then Aunt Beatrice's voice, agreeing in tones of barely suppressed confusion and calculation, and the butler was suddenly beside Eleanor, gesturing that she should enter. And she took one shaking breath and stepped through the doorway into the room where Alexander turned to face her, and his entire expression softened into something so warm and certain that her doubt crumbled like ash, and Aunt Beatrice was saying something about stepping just outside to maintain propriety, but remaining near enough to observe convention. And then they were alone, except for the open door, and Eleanor could not seem to find words as Alexander crossed the space between them and took both her hands in his and said quietly that he hoped she was ready because he was about to change everything. Alexander led Eleanor through the French doors into the small garden behind Ashworth House, a space she knew intimately because she had spent countless hours here alone among the roses and lavender, while her cousins entertained inside, and the afternoon sun fell golden through the leaves overhead, casting shifting patterns of light and shadow across the stone path, and she could hear the distant sounds of London beyond the garden walls, but they seemed impossibly far away as Alexander turned to face her and took both her hands in his with a gentleness that made her chest ache. He looked at her for a long moment without speaking, and she could see something blazing in his dark eyes that looked like joy and determination and a tenderness so profound it made her want to weep. And when he finally spoke, his voice was low and steady and absolutely certain, as he said that he had rehearsed elegant speeches about why she should accept him, had planned to list all the rational reasons they were suited. But standing here with her hand in his, he found he could not hide behind logic or propriety, and the simple truth was that he loved her completely and irrevocably. Eleanor felt her breath catch in her throat because no one had ever said those words to her, had never imagined anyone would. And Alexander continued speaking with his eyes never leaving her face, saying that he had spent 38 years waiting without knowing what he waited for until he saw her at the Pemberton ball maintaining her dignity while the world dismissed her. And he had watched her quiet strength and discovered in their conversations a mind that challenged him, a perspective that illuminated familiar things newly, a kindness that had survived circumstances that would have made others bitter or hard. He said that society would call this match unequal and they would be right, but not in the way they imagined, because Eleanor brought grace and wisdom and genuine goodness, while he offered merely wealth and title, things that meant nothing without someone to share them with, someone who saw him as simply Alexander rather than the Duke of Thornmere. And he had never felt so clearly seen or so peacefully understood as he did in her presence. She tried to speak, to tell him she could not possibly be worthy of this, but he lifted one hand to gently touch her cheek and said that he knew she doubted her own value because she had been told lies her entire life by people too foolish to recognize treasure when it stood before them. But he saw her clearly, and he was asking her to trust his vision, to believe him when he said she was extraordinary and deserving of every happiness, and would she do him the immeasurable honor of becoming his wife? He released her hands only long enough to withdraw the small velvet box from his coat pocket, opening it to reveal a sapphire ring that gleamed deep blue in the afternoon light, and he said this had been his mother's, and she had told him to give it only to a woman who made his heart feel both peaceful and wild at once. And Eleanor was that woman, the only woman, and he would spend the rest of his life ensuring she never doubted her worth again if she would only say yes. Eleanor looked at the ring and then at his face and saw nothing but absolute sincerity and love so overwhelming it seemed impossible that it could be directed at her, and she felt something break open in her chest, all the years of resignation and suppressed hope and quiet grief shattering like glass, and she realized she was crying as she whispered, "Yes, yes, 1,000 times, yes." And Alexander smiled with such pure joy that he looked years younger as he slipped his mother's ring onto her finger where it fit perfectly. And then he pulled her gently into his arms and held her against his chest while she trembled and wept, and finally allowed herself to believe she was chosen and cherished and loved. They remained in the garden as the afternoon light shifted toward gold and amber, Eleanor still trembling slightly in Alexander's arms, with her face pressed against his chest, where she could hear the steady beating of his heart. And when she finally lifted her head to look at him, she saw such profound happiness in his expression that it made her own heart feel too large for her chest, and he smiled down at her while gently brushing away the tears still clinging to her lashes, saying that he supposed they should return inside to inform her aunt officially, though he suspected the entire household already knew, given how long they had been absent. Eleanor nodded, but found herself reluctant to leave this perfect moment suspended in the garden, where it felt like they existed in their own world, separate from society's judgment. And Alexander seemed to understand, because he took her left hand and lifted it to examine the sapphire ring now gracing her finger, saying that his mother would have loved Eleanor and approved completely of his choice. And Eleanor felt fresh tears threaten as she thought of the mother she had lost and the mother she would never meet, but who had somehow blessed this union through the ring that symbolized acceptance into Alexander's family. He tucked her hand into the crook of his arm with a possessive gentleness that thrilled her and led her back toward the house. And as they walked the short distance, Eleanor caught sight of faces peering quickly away from windows, and she realized that Aunt Beatrice and her cousins had indeed been watching, and the thought that had once filled her with shame now brought only a fierce satisfaction, because let them watch her happiness. Let them see that the useless spinster cousin they had mocked and dismissed was chosen by the most powerful duke in England, not despite her lack of fortune and beauty, but because he valued qualities they had never bothered to recognize. When they entered through the French doors into the drawing-room, they found Aunt Beatrice standing near the fireplace, trying to arrange her features into appropriate congratulatory pleasure while failing to hide her shock, and Lydia and Isabella had mysteriously appeared from wherever they had been, both staring at Eleanor's hand where the sapphire gleamed unmistakably. And Alexander addressed them all with perfect formal courtesy, saying that Miss Ashworth had done him the great honor of accepting his proposal of marriage, and he hoped they would share in their happiness. Aunt Beatrice recovered enough to offer stiff felicitations, while her eyes calculated rapidly what advantages might now flow to the family through Eleanor's spectacular match. And Lydia looked as though she had been struck, her beautiful face pale and pinched as she stared at Eleanor with something between disbelief and envy. And Isabella attempted a smile that looked more like a grimace as she stammered some proper words of congratulation that rang entirely hollow. Alexander seemed oblivious to the undercurrents, or perhaps simply unconcerned, as he announced that he would be sending notice to the papers immediately, and they would be married by special license within the month, as he saw no reason to delay once he had secured his heart's desire. And he looked at Eleanor as he said this with such open adoration that Aunt Beatrice actually gasped at the impropriety of such emotion displayed so publicly. Eleanor felt a wild joy rising in her chest that she could barely contain. And for the first time in the 10 years she had lived as a dependent in this house, she met her aunt's eyes directly, and without the habitual lowering of her gaze that acknowledged her inferior position. And she saw Aunt Beatrice recognize the shift, saw the moment when the older woman understood that Eleanor would never again be the powerless relation to be ordered about and dismissed, because she would be the Duchess of Thornmere and would outrank them all. Alexander remained at Ashworth House for another hour, sitting with Eleanor in the drawing-room under the watchful and slightly dazed eyes of Aunt Beatrice, who seemed unable to fully comprehend the transformation that had occurred. And he held Eleanor's hand openly with a possessiveness that would have been scandalous before their engagement, but was now merely the privilege of a betrothed man, and they spoke of practical matters like the wedding date and where they would live, with Alexander explaining that they would divide their time between his London townhouse and his principal country estate in Derbyshire, called Thornmere Park, which encompassed nearly 1,000 acres of parkland and farmland. Eleanor listened with a sense of unreality washing over her as he described the house with its 80 rooms and extensive gardens, and the staff of more than 100 servants. And she thought of her tiny attic room with its sloped ceiling and single narrow bed, and wondered how she would possibly navigate a world so far beyond anything she had known. But Alexander seemed to sense her anxiety, because he squeezed her hand gently and said that Thornmere had been lonely and cold feeling despite its grandeur, until he imagined her there filling it with warmth and intelligence and kindness. And she would make it a home rather than merely a showplace. He departed finally as the afternoon light began to fade, kissing her hand with a tenderness that made her blush, while Aunt Beatrice watched with an expression hovering between approval and residual shock, and after he left the house seemed to exhale as though it had been holding its breath. And immediately Lydia and Isabella descended upon the drawing-room like birds of prey, their earlier stiff congratulations dissolving into a flurry of questions and barely concealed envy. Lydia demanded to know how Eleanor had possibly managed to capture the Duke's attention when she had no beauty or accomplishment to recommend her, and the question was phrased as bewilderment, but Eleanor heard the underlying accusation that she must have employed some trick or deception. And Isabella wondered aloud with false sweetness whether Eleanor felt prepared to assume the duties of a duchess, given her complete lack of experience in managing estates or moving in the highest circles of society. Eleanor felt the familiar shrinking sensation beginning in her chest, the old habit of accepting their criticisms as truth. But then she looked down at the sapphire ring glowing on her finger and remembered Alexander's words about her worth, and she lifted her chin and met Lydia's eyes directly, and said with quiet firmness that the Duke seemed to believe her capable, and that was the only opinion that mattered to her. The shock on both her cousins' faces was deeply satisfying, and Aunt Beatrice made a small choking sound, as though Eleanor's calm assertion of her own value was somehow improper, and Lydia's face flushed an ugly red as she snapped that Eleanor should not become too proud, simply because she had somehow managed to catch a husband after everyone had given up on her as a permanent spinster. The words were meant to wound, to cut Eleanor back down to the position of inferiority she had occupied for so long. But instead, Eleanor felt a strange liberation, because these women no longer had any power over her future or her happiness, and she realized that their cruelty had always stemmed from their own insecurities, rather than any actual deficiency in herself. And she said quietly that she was grateful to the Duke for seeing qualities in her that others had overlooked. And then she excused herself and walked from the room with her head high, leaving her aunt and cousins staring after her in stunned silence at this unprecedented display of self-possession from the woman they had spent 10 years dismissing as useless. Eleanor retreated to her attic room after the confrontation with her cousins, her legs trembling with residual emotion and the unfamiliar sensation of having stood up for herself still vibrating through her chest like a plucked harp string, and she sat on her narrow bed in the small space that had been both refuge and prison for 10 years, looking around at the sloped ceiling and worn carpet and single small window with the sudden knowledge that she would soon leave this room forever and become someone entirely different from the woman who had endured so much quiet misery within these walls. She removed the sapphire ring carefully and held it up to catch the fading afternoon light, watching how the blue stone seemed to hold depths of color that shifted as she turned it. And she thought about Alexander's hands placing it on her finger and his voice saying she was his heart's desire. And the impossibility of those words being directed at her still made her want to laugh and cry simultaneously. The next weeks passed in a blur of activity that left Eleanor feeling as though she had been caught in a swift current that was carrying her toward a destination she could barely comprehend, and Alexander was a constant presence, calling at Ashworth House daily with a persistence that scandalized Aunt Beatrice and drove Lydia into barely concealed fits of jealous rage, and he seemed determined to ensure that Eleanor never doubted his commitment, or had time to retreat back into the protective shell of self-doubt she had inhabited for so long. He took her driving in Hyde Park in his elegant curricle, where all of society could see them together, and he brought her to meet his elderly aunt, Lady Catherine, who lived in a grand house in Berkeley Square, and who looked at Eleanor with sharp, assessing eyes before pronouncing that the girl had sense and character which were worth more than a pretty face that would fade. And Alexander had smiled at Eleanor with such warmth that she had felt heat rise to her cheeks. The wedding preparations proceeded with terrifying speed, as Alexander had meant what he said about obtaining a special license and marrying within the month, and Eleanor found herself swept along to modistes and drapers and jewelers, with Alexander insisting on providing her entire trousseau, despite Aunt Beatrice's protests that it was not proper, and when Eleanor had hesitantly suggested that perhaps they should wait longer for a more traditional courtship, he had taken both her hands in his and said firmly that he had waited 38 years to find her, and he would not wait one day longer than necessary to make her his wife. Lady Margaret had reappeared like a fairy godmother, taking charge of details that overwhelmed Eleanor and running interference with Aunt Beatrice, who kept trying to insert herself into arrangements while simultaneously criticizing every choice. And Margaret had pulled Eleanor aside one afternoon and told her that her mother would have been so happy to see her daughter cherished as she deserved. And Eleanor had wept in the older woman's arms with a combination of grief for what her mother had not lived to see and joy at the unexpected blessing that had transformed her life. The wedding took place on June the 2nd in the private chapel at Ravenscroft House, with only a small gathering of witnesses, including Lady Margaret, who wept openly throughout the ceremony, and Thomas Pembroke, who stood as Alexander's groomsman, and even Alexander's stern Aunt Catherine, who dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, and Eleanor had expected her aunt and cousins to attend out of social obligation, but they had sent a coldly formal note declining the invitation with some transparent excuse about prior commitments. And Eleanor had felt a moment of old hurt before realizing that their absence was actually a gift, because it meant her wedding day would contain only people who genuinely wished her happiness rather than those who resented it. She wore a gown of ivory silk that Alexander had commissioned from the finest modiste in London, with delicate embroidery at the hem and sleeves that had taken 3 seamstresses a full week to complete. And Lady Margaret had woven white roses into her hair and fastened her mother's pearl necklace around her throat. And when Eleanor had looked at herself in the mirror before descending to the chapel, she had seen not the plain spinster cousin she had believed herself to be for so long, but a woman whose face glowed with happiness and whose eyes shone with the knowledge of being cherished. Alexander had stood waiting for her at the altar in his formal dress, with an expression of such profound love and satisfaction that Eleanor's breath had caught in her throat. And as she walked toward him through the small chapel with its stained glass windows casting colored light across the stone floor, she had thought that this moment was so impossibly perfect that surely she must wake and find it all a dream. But then his hand had closed warm and solid around hers, and she knew it was beautifully real. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of ritual words and responses, with Eleanor's voice trembling as she spoke her vows, and Alexander's voice deep and steady and absolutely certain. And when the clergyman pronounced them husband and wife, and Alexander kissed her with a tenderness that made her eyes sting with tears, she felt as though her entire life up to this moment had been a long, dark corridor that had suddenly opened into brilliant sunlight. The wedding breakfast afterward was an intimate affair with champagne and elaborate dishes that Eleanor barely tasted because she was too aware of Alexander's presence beside her, and his hand occasionally covering hers on the table, and the way he looked at her as though she were something precious beyond measure. And Lady Margaret had toasted them with words about true love recognizing true worth, and Thomas Pembroke had made a gracious speech about his friend's happiness. And through it all, Eleanor kept touching the gold wedding band on her finger as though to reassure herself of its reality.